This is uRoutine's You Are Infinite podcast, the show where host Ed Johnson explores the daily habits, routines and stories of world-class thinkers and doers. Each week you'll hear from experts who share small practices that fuel big results. Hit subscribe and let's jump into today's episode.
Kit, welcome.
Thanks, Ed. Pleasure to be here.
So, Kit, CEO and co-founder of Augmentive, 20,000 hours of care that have been provided through your platform, more than 3,000 patients, hundreds of care providers, and most impressively, I think 99.7% positive success rate. Tell us about it.
No, it's been an amazing journey. I'd probably caveat that the success rate is after an appointment, that's a patient saying that they would recommend their specialist. A lot we look into in terms of what's a successful relationship, and it's an ongoing process, I guess. It's a journey. But yeah, it's been a great journey for us too. It's been an amazing experience. We really loved the process of building Augmentive. Started the journey, started processing and researching the problem for some time before we actually sort of broke ground. But yeah, it's been fantastic.
And talk me through that journey. So where did the idea originate? You talk about your diagnosis with ADHD. Was that the trigger for it, or was that something that was diagnosed subsequently? Where did the original idea come from?
Yeah, so my own ADHD diagnosis actually came further down the line. So the genesis, I guess, for Augmentive was that my brother and I were working together. We'd set up a sort of software and AI lab. And we were working on some really interesting projects, getting exposure to some very exciting new technologies, and in particular sort of within the field of artificial intelligence. And I'd seen a lot of friends struggle with their mental health, and a childhood friend of mine sadly took their own life. And I think that was the point at which I'd been constantly aware that it was very easy to get sort of butter delivered to your door, but then incredibly valuable support that theoretically should be easier because it can be delivered remotely, was lagging way behind, and there were so many sectors that were proving that it's possible. So we sort of looked at that, we saw friends struggle, and I guess sort of alongside that we were looking at our mum. So our mum is a therapist, and we'd come home and we'd see her on the sofa just exhausted. And I think people in the mental health sector work very, very hard. It's not just the sort of what goes into it from a day-to-day perspective. There's a high sort of emotional load that they carry, and so we were looking at people that needed support. We were looking at our mum, and we just felt that this was the sort of very large problem. I think we were aware that it wasn't going to be solved. There was no silver bullet. There was no sort of layer that would come in and make this problem go away. So we felt we were willing to work for decades, if necessary, on helping people like my friends and my mum. And obviously, like any entrepreneur, you underestimate just how hard that's going to be. So I think that's really important, being slightly naive, but also sort of fully committed.
And you talk about your brother and you working on this, and obviously the connection with your mother as a therapist, also presumably subsequently working with Augmentive.
Yeah.
How does that play into the kind of personal, professional, the work-life balance, the pressures that might bring as well? Talk about that.
There's no balance. That's how it plays in. I think we're very lucky. I think I love the anecdote. I guess it's probably not a rule, but you become an aggregate of the 5 people you spend most time with, and I'm very lucky that the sort of the 5, the 10, the 20 people that I spend most time with are all the sort of people you'd like to learn from and sort of assimilate a lot of their traits. And so I love working with them. I think I learn a lot from them. We work together very nicely, but also it's 24/7 really. When you're not working, you're always preparing to go back into work, and I guess it means that we don't see it as a problem. We don't mind the fact that maybe on Christmas Day, you're working a little bit, you're replying to a few emails, you're having a little discussion here or there. I think they say if you love what you do, you never work a day, and it's obviously a cliche, and there are moments where that really doesn't feel true. But that dynamic is very fluid. There isn't much balance, and that doesn't really bother us too much. It's just sort of a different way of looking at it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, they say that entrepreneurs kind of live and breathe what they're doing, and there's no downtime on that. Obviously, a big focus with what we're building at uRoutine is to try and give people a bit of structure, and arguably the people that need the most structure in some respects are those entrepreneurs that are doing every job under the sun.
Yeah.
How does How does routine fit into what you do, Kit? How is it part of your daily life?
As you'll know, Ed, like particularly with a startup, I think this sort of the rate of change maybe slows down a little bit. But you need sort of a baseline level of routine, and I think you've got to put yourself sort of physically in a position where you can turn up on a regular basis. I think certainly, again, I can't talk for the audience, but for myself, it's about consistency over a long period of time, accumulating value. And so your routines will probably need to evolve at a higher level, maybe more of a sort of psychological, emotional level. But it's about getting a good base level of sort of good physical habits. So making sure you get your sleep. For me, it's like sort of sleep. I prioritize like getting good food as easy as possible. So I'm an avid user of delivery. I'm not a very good cook, and I don't have a huge amount of information in that area. So sort of trying to simplify that. So, and then the main thing is just walking on a regular basis. So for me, actually working with Sarah, there's the sort of who's a therapist. There is a sort of psychological aspect and an emotional aspect to it. It's great to be able to go and walk and talk with her, regulate emotions, process thoughts. And again, it's that sort of overlap. Very often the things that are sort of bothering me would be both professional and personal. And it's the same with Archie, although normally more technical. So it's making sure that you kind of eating relatively good food, you've slept properly, and then you get out for those walks to process everything on a regular basis. And I walk through my socks within like 2 weeks. I have to sort of constantly buy new socks. That's like the bane of my life at the moment, because I do a lot of walking, a lot of processing.
I think that's a good problem to have. I think if your socks are lasting for too long, you aren't walking enough, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I always say.
I was going to say, one of the things that we spoke about before recording this session was that idea of, in the startup space and as an entrepreneur, wartime versus peacetime, I think is the phrase you used. Tell me a bit more about that and how that might look for you.
Yeah, I think it's an expression that came from my dad. So I think it's very, very interesting, and I do believe that people can do both. I think there are people that certainly specialise in one or the other. And I think probably, so in terms of startups and that world, I think it's very difficult to be, I think, a peacetime sort of leader in the first stages of a startup, because very often you're building something new, challenging a status quo. So I think it favours that type of mentality and the sort of the lifestyle, the behaviours that come with it. But I do think as you start to sort of grow and maybe you get product market fit and more people are involved, that's where the ability to sort of at least go to more towards the middle is really, really important. And so then it's less maybe about carrying everything yourself. Maybe to a certain extent, when you look at the output of a business, even if you're working really hard, it's going to become a smaller and smaller percentage. So at that point, the sort of really extreme hours and, I guess intensity of what you do in those hours, like it becomes less important, and it's about having a clearer mind and being able to sort of communicate, sort of devolve to other people, some decision making. So I think at that point, maybe that's where the more sustainable, balanced approach to your life and your work life is important. And I think that's one of the sort of where we're getting to now. And it's probably one of the things that pushed me, I guess, into getting my own ADHD diagnosis is maybe in the early stages, that ability to be just sort of like block out almost everything, intuitively prioritize, because you care so much that you have to, you just can't not solve the thing that threatens your baby kind of thing. But then over time, what you realize is that you can't do it all yourself. You need more and more people involved. And that's, I think, at the point at which I was like, okay, well, I need to have a slightly more organized, structured approach. And that's, I imagine, where a peacetime CEO probably differentiates from maybe more of or one of the ways, I guess, from a wartime CEO or leader.
Interesting, really interesting to hear you talk about it in that way, and really good description of it. Going back to that reference that you've just made to your ADHD diagnosis, are you happy sharing a bit more about what that process looked like, getting to the point of being diagnosed with ADHD, and how it first manifested itself, how you found solutions to it, how things have changed, knowing now that you do know that you have ADHD, and how you manage that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that everyone has their own journey there, and therefore the way they look at that period beforehand can change. So with Augmentive, we primarily, sort of the main reason why people come to us is for an assessment and treatment for ADHD. And a lot of the people coming to us are pretty frustrated, certainly, maybe even angry. And I think there's that sense of sometimes what could have been if they'd got this support earlier. And there are moments when I have those feelings where I'm a bit like, it would have been amazing if I could have had this clarity and started to adjust those sort of behaviours and habits when I was going through school, for instance. But for me anyway, I was very fortunate. I was very lucky to have structure around me, and also a structure that held me within, I think, a level where I wasn't dropping out of systems. I certainly wasn't flourishing. I was sort of relatively in the middle. But I also had support from my family, my friends, and other people around that meant that I was, encouraged, I guess, to play to my own strengths. So, if I wanted to move outside of, I guess, the normal sort of things that you would study or work on, there was a lot of encouragement for that to sort of think outside the box. And I think for a lot of people, maybe there isn't that. Maybe they aren't in a position where they can afford to take those types of risks. So I guess when I look back at that journey, I look back at it as, in a positive light, and I think learning to try and work really, really hard with that support to survive in that system meant that when I actually did properly move out and start to make my own way, that I'd sort of become accustomed to having to almost overwork to get sort of relatively average results at times.
And do you think you'd have come to the realisation or sought a diagnosis had you not been working in the industry that you're working in? Had you not been surrounded by therapists or had your mother as a therapist? Do you think you'd have got to that point without that?
It's a really, really good question. I certainly think it would have taken longer. I mean, again, for context, so we have a team of 15 plus of some of the top doctors in the country specialising in ADHD and autism. We're lucky enough to speak with them on a regular basis. We're exposed to a lot of research. We talk to patients every day. And even taking that into account, it took me, probably 18 months, 2 years to go through that process myself. And it would have taken certainly a lot longer. I think that you just hear there is certainly a fear of overdiagnosis, and I think that was probably the main reason why. I think I understood what it was, but I think there was a lot of clickbait and a lot of, I don't really understand, but very angry people that maybe sort of confuse neurodiversity with maybe being woke or I don't know what. But all this, there was quite a lot of sort of malicious content out there that, from people that weren't particularly informed. There are people that are well informed that are also saying you've got to be very careful about the way that you go through this. But I think in general there's a lot of quite negative noise around overdiagnosis and people sort of saying, well, social media has a big impact on your attention span, and maybe that's just what's happening here amongst young people. So it probably would have taken a lot longer because of all that noise. But I think eventually I would have reached the same point I reached, which is, you need to be able to evolve.
And do you think that there is a stigma around people approaching treatment? Do you find in the research that's done, in the work that you do with the therapists that you work with, that people are cautious or worried or anxious or afraid of contacting somebody and asking for that support? Yeah,
I think we've come a long way. I think when you look at 4 or 5 years ago, I think we were already starting to see a lot of positive progress. Again, we work with some great doctors, and I think I learn a lot from them. Everyone gets anxious, everyone gets stressed, people get low. I think it's really important that you expect that and you lean into it and you actually listen to it, and it's normally telling you something. And I think we're now at the point where people are pretty well versed. They're pretty articulate and adept at understanding kind of, when is it a mental health issue and when is it a sort of natural emotion. And we're probably not good enough at sort of distinguishing between what requires help and what doesn't. So what's sort of a normal level and what's a sort of, when are you impaired and when is that the right time? I think that's probably a point where we're not at. But I think in terms of being open to accessing support, we've made a lot of progress. There's still more progress to come. There's certainly, amongst men, more that could be done in terms of pushing the narrative there. and preventing people from waiting so it's quite severe. I think it's probably more that the confidence that you'll get the help you need isn't high enough. I think people feel as though you're constantly reading about NHS waiting lists or and I think the sort of the accessibility to effective care and the good news stories about people who've gone through those systems, and it's not necessarily going to keep you better forever. Maybe you'll need top ups, but I think that's probably something that could really help move further. And I would say ADHD is one of those. If you go sort of more deeper into that, ADHD, I would say that there is not a massive stigma. To be honest with you, I think people are relatively comfortable with that diagnosis, and I think treatment-wise, there's a little bit of stigma, particularly around the medication side of things, and maybe a lack of confidence around going down a non-pharmacological route. But I think probably it's more autism is the one that I think is really is lagging, and I think people really need to. I think there needs to be more conversation around that.
And do you think that the next big step in Augmentive's journey? What do you see the future of Augmentive being? What are the big sort of focuses for you and the business in the next few years then?
So we're focusing on neurodiversity, so in particular ADHD and autism, and it's sort of at a very naive level. What we want to do is make accessing mental health care for this population as easy as ordering a Deliveroo. So it's a very simplified version, but like quality care. So get that clarity from an expert-led assessment, and then a personalised treatment plan that you trust. We want to make that as easy as it's as accessible. It's right there. There's a lot that goes into that. It's not just about building a great app. It's also about the sort of affordability, the governance, etc. But that's sort of what we're working towards. It's giving it's about 15% of the population that are neurodiverse. So there's millions of people in there. A lot of people have had an assessment, and I think they have a handle on it, but then maybe not sort of as in control of the negative aspects of that condition as they'd like. So building that kind of home for those people.
I mean, it's a fantastic thing that you're building, and it's amazing looking at some of the statistics and some of the things that you shared beforehand. Mm-hmm. Obviously, working with the care providers that you do, there must be some really interesting research that you see and some really interesting research data. Is there any in particular that you're able to share, or any learnings from the last few years that you've either thought, gosh, that's fascinating, or wow, that could really make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, we're incredibly fortunate. That's one of the things almost on a daily basis. Like you sort of go through a process of self-reflection, and you realise that around the business we're surrounded by really high-quality individuals that you learn from, and and within the business as well, the care providers are very inspirational, and it's taken them a long time to get to this point, and so we're constantly learning. I'm trying to think of some interesting. I think probably the sort of theme, I guess, that stands out is so within neurodiversity, how this population are such big outliers. So when you look at, for instance, how likely you are to either just rocket and achieve something remarkable, or to fall through the cracks of society, I think it's fascinating when you dive into the data. So you have, for instance, the sort of entrepreneurial community. You are 5 times more likely to set up a company if you're neurodiverse. So the number of people that go and create a company. And then obviously you look at some of the sort of the leaders in the world right now, like your Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Richard Branson. These guys have spoken about their the neurodevelopmental conditions that they've experienced and the way in which it's impacted their careers. So there's like this sort of you learn a lot. And one of our doctors at the moment I saw the other day is doing a PhD, and she's been working in the prison system. And actually, again, if you look at the prevalence, I think there's some interesting data, but again, like you should always be skeptical, or really kind of like understand that there are limitations in terms of the research. But again, it's about 5 times higher, the prevalence of neurodiversity in the prison system than in the general population. I think you probably see slightly higher testing in prisons, which may explain that. But it was really fascinating looking at why the prison system has such high rates of autistic individuals. And she's doing that research while also sort of saying that very often, so one of the big spikes that we've seen recently is an awareness around how common it is to have both ADHD and autism. And so it's roughly 30 to 70% of the time someone with ADHD has traits of autism. And what she's amazed at is how often those autism traits lead to success. So very often when someone has both, it can be an amazing combination. And it's a combination one of our other doctors, Dr. Khurram Sadiq, has. He's on 6 TED Talks. He talks about this balance of, I guess, the sometimes chaos with ADHD and the order that comes with his autism. And how you can sort of place those strengths, I guess, and how they offset one another.
You talk about falling through the cracks or flying and being really successful. Mm-hmm. What do you think, in your opinion, is the differentiating factor between the two? So what defines or what dictates whether someone is going to fly or fall through the cracks?
The short answer is I don't know. I mean, it's a great question. I would guess that it comes down to the sort of the support structure around the individual. And again, this could be naive. I'm sure some of if any of our doctors are listening, they might be like, they may be sort of emailing me tomorrow to correct after this goes out. But I would imagine it's around that support structure. So I personally think that you imitate and you mimic the people around you. And so if you have people around you, potentially, particularly those that also that have the same condition and have experienced the same things, and they've managed to find and hack together, I guess, little stacks of habits. If you see those and you can copy them and you can mimic them, then I do think that can help. You're learning, you're borrowing that learning. That's probably the main sort of thing that I would point to is a sort of community of people who are maybe working, they have the same setup and they're working to a similar goal, and you can look at what's worked for them and you can kind of borrow that learning and stand on the shoulders of giants.
And the accountability side of things, do you think that plays into it? Does that play into things for you? And then also off the back of that, how do you find that, going back to working with family, do you find that is therefore more accountability, or how does that impact the work that you do?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the group we work with, I think when a lot of people come into Augmentive, they're frustrated, they waited for ages, and they finally get their diagnosis of clarity, and I think they want to feel change early. And from my experience anyway, medication's a great way to come in and, if you have ADHD and you're struggling in that area with certain aspects of that, it can, very, very quickly people are like, wow, this has changed my life. And that's certainly how I felt. But then after the period of time, sometimes people want to come off that medication. Other people just, over time, very often people look to supplement it with tools. And I think one of the big tools we're seeing from coaches is things like body doubling. And having a coach that you go back, and people do follow-ups when they start medication with our doctors. But working with a coach can give you that accountability. So they give you different tools. And so we are starting to see that, particularly later in the pathway, being a very, very effective way to kind of retrain your brain and lock in certain behaviors that maybe weren't existing before. But that's almost from a sort of support alongside you, which is a form of accountability. For me, I get that from my family and working with them. Certainly when I talk to, they're very, very good. Again, it's one of those things. I'm sure uRoutine. You don't want to surround yourself with yes men. You want to surround yourself with people that are going to challenge you, not just in terms of the sort of the pure business side, but also the way you're behaving, etc. And so they know what keeps you in a healthy habit, and they will hold you accountable to those types of things and what's good for the organisation. But then I just think a board, to be honest with you, this is sort of relatively boring answer, but having a good chairman, having good people on your board, that's a very, very strong form of accountability, and that's certainly been a real help for me anyway.
I know from first-hand experience that the chairman that I appointed when I was running Push Far, I appointed because he slightly terrified me and he was going to hold me accountable. I knew that every month or every 3 months when we went into board meetings, I had to have the answers. Yeah. And if I didn't, I was in trouble. And I was worried about being in trouble, so therefore I would deliver.
Yeah, it's a slightly terrifying experience. It still is, but I think in particularly the first few board meetings as well, when you go in and you know that it's going to be a deep dive and you've got to process and present a lot of information. And our chairman was he was in the army as well. And I think I think they're very effective at building habits and routines, in particular through sort of repetition. And so that experience was rigorous, and I think it was a very good way to internalize good behaviors.
Absolutely. And yeah, as you say, there's nothing more terrifying than going into one of those board meetings in the early days when you're at zero revenue and you've got very little revenue, and that's the one metric that everyone cares about at any point in a startup, but particularly in the early stages of a startup. And I think there are some entrepreneurs and founders who make a point in the investor updates, whenever they're sending them every month, every quarter, of putting that at the front and center at the top of the email, saying revenue, whatever it is, and if it's zero, they have to say that it's zero, obviously.
Yeah.
And that puts you in a really strong position when it comes to kind of being held accountable and knowing that you've got to perform on that.
Yeah, and I think a good board also give you some leeway in terms of, I think you look at OKRs, and very often you can I guess frame that metric with other metrics. And so for us, what we do look at revenue, of course, as you say, like any business has to look at that. But you can set the narrative, and you can say, we do care about this. We also care about patient outcomes, about user experience, about marketing efficiency, all these types of. And so I think a good board will give you that the ability to sort of frame it as well with other metrics. But what's so important is that they keep you sort of focused on those and consistently working on those, and you don't just sort of switch the metrics up on a regular basis to suit you. And it's that kind of, they do allow you to change. If something happens in the business, you spot an opportunity or you need to calibrate, as long as you can sort of explain that rationally. But that sort of focus is so valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Focusing on the right metrics, not changing them up just to suit the narrative, as you say.
But I think I love the Sam Altman thing about, I think he said the only arbitrage left for startups is like time frames. And I love this because I think in general there's an amazing TED talk on like the sort of instant gratification monkey. And I think in general, like if you look at apps, they're so adept at sort of triggering instant gratification. And I think almost as a generation, we're very short-term minded. Like if you look at most things are sort of, if you look at the Rory Sutherland talks about what you could do if you were to spend the same money on shortening the Eurostar, on like improving the experience, we're all focused on like how can you be quicker. But if you actually, as a business, if you actually sort of step back and you think longer term, then I think you can sort of build much greater value through compound growth.
And that consistency over time that you talk about, and those turning up and showing up every day, even when it's hard, at the start of the business and at various points throughout it, right?
Yeah, and I think if you look at your sort of good founders that I think it's very often impossible to see when you speak to someone just how relentless they are, or consistent, or resilient. You think of it almost being as sort of like a physical thing or whatever, but actually it's someone, they're often very quiet, the people that just plug away, and are willing to do the odd sort of, working at the weekend or whatever it might be, or when things are going really awfully and you've got to really think through and talk to people. It's very difficult to identify those people that are going to be consistent.
And you only end up hearing about them once they've made a success, and you don't really hear about the 5, 10, 15 years that went before it.
Yeah, exactly. I have a theory that the people that achieve the most interesting things probably live the most boring lives for a very long period before that. Like, I imagine like Ronaldo, Messi, I'm more of a Messi man myself, but I imagine they probably have such boring lives for like 90% of it. It's probably just eating well, sleeping, rehab, and then they go on a pitch and they do something amazing and everyone's like, wow, these guys are just, the coolest people ever. But imagine when they're in bed at like, yeah.
It's that consistency. I remember talking to a personal trainer who said, what's your goal? And I said, I'd love to look good on the beach. And he said, gosh, you have such a boring life if you want to look like a model. Looking like a model looks like a great life. You're always, on these fashion shoots and runways and everything. And when you're not on the front page of magazines, you're eating kale and chicken breasts and going to sleep and not drinking, and you're in the gym and doing nothing else. And it's like, well, actually, maybe I don't want that anymore.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? It's and that's one of the things. So one of the things with Augmentive is that you have those moments as well where you're in sessions, and that's really valuable. So on the other side as well, when you work on it, I think the moments of flow and fulfillment, you also kind of want to optimize for that. So you're only on the beach for a relatively short period of time, and I guess the habits and behaviour side of things is probably what keeps you in the flow state in between. Like, that's probably what the right balance to find, or the thing to look for when you're building those habits.
Some really interesting conversations there, and some really interesting insights. Thank you so much for sharing those. For anybody interested in Augmentive and what you're doing, who has heard anything today and thinks they might need to or want to find out more about the work you're doing, how can they get involved? How can they get in touch?
Sure. So they can head to our site, augmentive.io, not Argumentative. We had a post again yesterday calling us Augmentive. So Augmentive, AUGMENTIVE to be specific, .io. And we have the care providers on the site there, so you can have a look, find someone who looks relevant to you. You can also contact our team, and we'll help you find the right starting point and kind of guide you through that care pathway.
Amazing. Kit, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing everything that you have. And to everybody listening, thank you very much.